speaking in public, Jesus would often teach by the means of parables. And then, more privately, he would explain to the disciples what these parables meant. Welcome to another tidbit. We are studying the Gospel of Mark, and we have arrived to the first sermon, the first preaching, the first chapter with a lot of words in Mark, because Mark likes the narratives. In chapter 4, however, he deals with parables. Jesus tells parables. He explains them to the disciples. But what I will do is, before looking into some of these parables in chapter 4, I want to look at chapter 3. Because from verse 13 in chapter 3, a new section of Mark begins. The first 3.5 chapters reveals the ministry of Jesus, maybe the typical ministry of Jesus. He preaches, he heals, he is then attacked, and there are confrontations with some of the Jews' leaders. Now Jesus calls disciples. He establishes the circle of the 12 disciples or apostles. And the following chapters, in reality, deal with how Jesus was teaching or educating his disciples in ministry. So that's the focus we need to remember. Now, before the parables begin, there is a section where the family of Jesus, in chapter 3, arrives in order to stop him. He's out of himself. He's acting like a madman, they say. Before we hear the reaction of Jesus to this accusation, his reaction to his family, which will come in the end of the chapter, there is inserted a discussion with the scribes and the Pharisees, who accuse Jesus for throwing out demons by the power of the evil himself, Beelzebub, the master of the flies. Now, this is a so-called sandwich story. We will see more sandwich stories later. The story about the execution of John the Baptist in the midst of the sending out and receiving of the disciples. We have the story about the woman with the blood disease in the midst of the healing or resurrection of the daughter of Jairus. Now here, this accusation of throwing out the demons by the power of the devil is put in the context of the family's wish to stop Jesus because he has gone mad. And now you see the connection. So, when Jesus in the end rejects his family in a sense, or rejects the accusation, doesn't follow the appeal to stop his ministry, he points to his disciples and those who follow him and says, those who follow me, those constitute my real family. This is a dramatic turn of, let's say, identity for his followers. And then back to one small expression in the story about this accusation. You throw out the demons by the power of the devil. As we read in verse 23 in chapter 3, it is said, so Jesus called them and spoke to them in parables. How can Satan drive out Satan? And then comes two proverb-like expressions. If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And as was common in the ancient Near East, house building and kingdom building are paralleled. But then your question may be, but this is called a parable. That isn't a parable, is it? Now, behind such a question lies the assumption that we know exactly what is meant with a parable, because we have now defined a parable, and on the basis of our definition, we impose that category on the biblical text. However, if we read the Bible from within, we will discover that what is meant with parabole in the New Testament includes more than what we would usually call parables. It would include proverbs, from Hebrew mashal, it could include riddles, and so on. And this is the case here. And with that, we move to the chapter on the parables, chapter 4. Jesus tells a parable. The parable about the sower. That is well known. Have you heard more sermons on any other topic than that particular parable? And then, as they come together afterwards, when he was alone, verse 10, the 12 and the others around him asked him about the parables. The others around him, that would include the women that served them, mentioned not by name here. And then he began explaining, the secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those on the outside everything is said in parables, so that, and now he quotes Isaiah, they may be ever seeing but never perceiving, and ever hearing but never understanding, otherwise they might turn and be forgiven. This is a quote from the prophet Isaiah, who spoke to a people with hard hearts and unwillingness to understand. Now, as we go along, we will discover that the disciples were very close to hearing and not understanding, seeing and not understanding either. So there is a danger that you and I and other disciples react as incomprehensible, something like that, like the disciples, or as the Jewish people at the time of Messiah, the Jewish leaders. Now, speaking about the pedagogy, the purpose of telling parables, here's at least one purpose which we find emphasized in the Gospel of Mark. When Jesus tells a parable, like the parable about the sower, he used daily life occurrences so that the listener would remember what Jesus said, and he would be reminded day after day, as these daily occurrences were something he faced, he encountered. And maybe he did not, or she did not understand what Jesus meant the first time, but sometime later it would dawn upon the listener. So the seed is sown, and sometime later, because it is an image that will be remembered, it will dawn upon those who heard Jesus speak. And now we turn to a couple of the parables. In verse 21 and 22, Jesus said to them, "Do you bring in a lamb to be put under a bowl or a bed? Instead, you put it on its stand. For whatever is hidden is meant to be disclosed. Whatever is concealed is meant to be brought out into the open." And that highlights a theme in the Gospel of Mark. That is the theme of secrecy and revelation. What is now hidden will one day be revealed. What is now small and unseen will one day grow. And that brings us to another parable. In verse 30, again he said, "What shall we say the kingdom of God is like? or what parable shall we use to describe it? It is like a mustard seed, which is the smallest seed you plant in the ground, yet when planted, it grows and becomes the largest of all garden plants, with such big branches that the birds of the air can perch in its shade. So, what you now see as small may be insignificant, one day will grow and become large, significant, and important. Speaking to the church of his day, probably a church with fewer high educated people, fewer people of power and significance, maybe slaves, many of them, Mark would point out, what we have now may seem small and insignificant, but one day it will grow and blossom, and one day the kingdom of God will be seen and visible, moving from what is small to that which becomes great. Like this first sermon chapter in Mark about the parables is succeeded by a second sermon chapter in verse 13 about the end of the world and the coming of the kingdom. From what is small, it will grow into something great and wonderful. This is a main theme of the Gospel of Mark. And then at the end of these parables, we are told once again, with many similar stories or parables, Jesus spoke the word to them as much as they could understand. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. But when he was alone with his disciples, he explained everything. He spoke to the public and then he explained to the disciples. Did they understand? As we go along, we discover they had a hard time. But that's for the next tidbits. Welcome back. Thank you for listening to this one.